Hello, and welcome to another episode of A Rough Sketch of History. Today's episode is The Deadly Puzzle. And in this episode, we're going to discuss the nature of trench warfare on the Western Front and try to come to an understanding of what that type of warfare was like and why it was waged in that manner. I think that if you know anything about the First World War, there's often a misconception that people have that the slaughter that took place on the Western Front was due to callousness and incompetence by politicians and generals. That it was a static war where people kept trying the same things over and over again with the same results, but same failures, but continued to do it anyway. And this really isn't true. Yes, there were incompetent generals and officers in the First World War. There are incompetent generals and officers in all wars. But the tactics of the war were far from stagnant. In fact, if you were to look at each year of the war, 1914, 1915, 1916, 17, 18, they all look different. The battles played out differently, different tactics, different weapons. There was this constant trying to solve this deadly puzzle. There was a problem that they couldn't get around. And frankly, I'll give you a bit of a spoiler of what this really was. A big part of why this war was deadlocked and why it was so difficult to overcome these struggles was the fact that communications technology had not caught up to weapons technology. By the time the Second World War rolled around, all of these units, people would have radios. People could talk directly to each other. In the First World War, the best form of communication was telephones with cords. So you can imagine that this worked well leading up near the battle. But in the battle itself, you couldn't communicate this way. And often messages had to be sent by runners. And strangely enough, a common form of communication was actually carrier pigeons. So pigeons that had been trained to fly back to a certain place. So again, I'm not making this up. There were battalion commanders that would have cages with pigeons in them, and they would write little notes that would go into a little capsule, little thing tied to their ankle, saying, where they were or asking requests for orders or this or that. And they'd let the pigeon go, and they were, because of their instincts, they fly back to their roost, which would be back at headquarters, and command would get an idea of what was going on. In fact, both sides were trained to shoot down the other side's pigeons. So, again, very advanced weapons technology, but communications was lacking, and we'll kind of see how they tried to get around this. So, as I mentioned in the last video, they say generals always try to fight the last war. And for the Americans, that was the American Civil War. And for many ways, for Europeans in 1914, that was still the Napoleonic battles of 1812, 1810. I mean, 100 years ago, they were still looking at these battles as kind of the definitive concept of how great powers should go to war with each other, because Europe had been in a period of relative peace, at least the major powers. There were certainly serious conflicts, but they tended to be short, and there certainly hadn't been a major conflict in Europe since these big technological changes we talked about in the last video: machine guns, hydraulic recoil artillery, planes, tanks. So nobody really knew how to expect how this would pan out. But before I start kind of drawing some sketches on how this type of battle plans were drawn, I once heard an analogy or an explanation that I think is really poignant to understand these changes, what we're going to see. Is that, anyway, I heard it explained that if you took a Napoleonic era officer, so a military officer from 1814, someone in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars and transported them 100 years into the future, into 1914. You could sit them down at any army in the world. They could look at a battle plan that was drawn up, and with a couple of brief explanations on maybe a few technical terms, they would completely understand that battle plan and, would actually be able to execute it in a combat situation. Now fast forward that same officer, that Napoleonic era officer, to 1918, just 4 years later. If you were to show him a battle plan in 1918, he would have next to no idea what he was looking at. And on the reverse side of this, if you took a World War I officer from 1918, traveled them to the future to today in 2018, and you were to show them a modern battle plan, again, they would know exactly what they were looking at. If you showed an American officer from 1918, some of the battle plans sketched out for the invasion of Iraq, for example, all of the symbols and things with just a few updates on maybe some more modern terms, it would make sense to them. Infantry tactics have not really changed much since then. There's been refinements, but the basic changes that happened between 1914 to 1918. That's what changed warfare from Napoleonic, pre-modern to the modern era. That is where the change happened. World War II saw a lot of refinements in these things, but they all came from the First World War. So now let's go back to the Napoleonic Tactics a little bit. This is what was expected at the beginning of the First World War. So let's take a look at a theoretical conflict between two forces of about, say, a battalion size. Now, there are names for military units, companies, battalions, platoons. You don't really need to know all those too well because, frankly, it's difficult to understand because those terms change their meaning depending on what year, what army. A company in the U.S. Army would be a different size than a company in the French Army, but the basic concepts are the same, and I'll give you the idea as we go through. But so a battalion would be about 1,000 soldiers, and these symbols are international military symbols for different types of units. Not exactly accurate, but they'll be enough to make the points. So this symbol with the X stands for an infantry unit. In this case, a company, which for this example we'll say is about, I guess we'll say there's going to be 800. So about 200 men. So about 800 men on both sides. Again, followed by this slash here that stands for a cavalry unit. Again, about another 200 men, and a artillery battery. Again, about 200 men. And these two forces, this would be a pre-war, pre-1914 battle plan of how a battle should be waged. And the first stage of the battle would be that the armies would close. This isn't quite, none of this is going to be fully to scale, but it will give you a general idea. But the cavalry and the artillery would be much farther to the back. The infantry would close together, but before so, the artillery would get into an artillery duel with both one another. They would be shooting back and forth, and they would also be shooting shells into each other's front line. Now, an important thing is that in pre-World War I theory, the battles would be bloody. They didn't have any illusions that this new technology wasn't going to cause mass casualties, but they didn't realize that it would take a long time. They assumed that these mass casualties would cause the battles to be short. So neither side artillery would have carried a lot of rounds. they probably would have thought they would only be firing for 5, 10, 15 minutes would have been a long time in their thinking. And then eventually these two forces would close close enough that they could start shooting back and forth with rifle fire. And they were thinking in terms of long distances, probably maybe 800, 1,000 yards. You know, you can imagine 1,000 yards away that they would just be specks. And that's why prior to 1914, the two big emphasis that armies would put was sort of morale, you know, esprit de corps, and marksmanship. You know, the side, and it does hold up that in many ways this was First World War was the first firepower war. Prior to this in history, armies didn't tend to annihilate another army. That's not what caused an army to lose. It was the side that ran away. And this was the concept, is that the side that was braver would withstand getting shot at better, and the side that was the better shot would inflict casualties faster. So the better shots, the braver men would win, you know, every time. And every army was convinced that their guys were the better shots and braver, with the exception of maybe the Russians, who just knew there were lots of them. But all right, let me take a dig at the Russians. They just different thinking and a lot of times strategic planning, but that's neither here nor there. So we have our friendly side here, our blue side, and of course, since they are better shots and they are braver, the infantry, the red infantry, start to fall back. They can't withstand the greater fire. Now, without this support, again, the artillery they have is going to start falling back. And its cavalry would essentially have one of two choices. It might either run away, or it might try to sort of ride forward to the front and sort of work as a screen to try to allow the infantry to fall back. Now, at this point, the victorious infantry would advance. And again, this was essentially the exact concept they had of how the First World War would go. And this really, tactically, this is no different than the Napoleonic War. It's not different than the American Civil War. This is the basic concept of how war had been fought in the sort of gunpowder age. And what would eventually happen is that anybody here that stood their ground would essentially have to face this force. They would charge in with their bayonets. There would be a glorious battle. And then they would finally fully be routed. And at that point, it would sort of be like a vice that the victorious, sorry, that should have been, this was the artillery firing, but so this would be the cavalry charging in and essentially trying to circle around, surrounding this force, causing it to be destroyed, and because they're in a panic, they're not going to put up an effective fight, destroyed and surrendered. And that's the end of the battle. This would happen on a huge scale, you know, many, many battalions, armies. Within a day or two, there would be a cataclysmic battle. One army would be clearly victorious, the other would be completely captured. The war would be over. There was no thought for a long war. Now, I know before that I said that, and I apologize, it should have been the artillery down here earlier that was showing the shooting, that the idea was that the artillery would play a brief role. So, though I said this was an artillery war, not at this point. Tactically, the concept wasn't there. They weren't given the huge amounts of ammunition that they would need to play a decisive role. They were still being used in the same way that they had always been used, almost like a big gun. You just wheeled it up and shot directly at the enemy. You weren't arcing the shot over large distances. You weren't shooting at something you couldn't see. So the artillery hadn't come in its own, but what had happened was that this army Red Army here would have fallen back, and they would have had small units in the rear, which there always, even Napoleonic times, would have been small units in the rear to kind of help screen a retreat. But this time, they had machine guns. So in a battalion of about 800 men, 2, 3, 4 machine guns wouldn't have been uncommon. And machine guns had been around for a while, and they had been used very effectively in colonial battles against, massive amounts of poorly trained local people in the colonies, oftentimes only fighting with, spears and shields or things like that. But the concept of them being a war-winning or a decisive thing on the battlefield in a European battlefield didn't exist. And the reason for that being is, if you remember before, that the kind of formula is that one machine gun would equal about 50 riflemen in firepower. So let's imagine this fictitious battle. We have 800 men here, like 1,000 if you include the cavalry. And let's say that this clash was very bloody. They lost 40%, which would have been really bad. So you have 600 men between the cavalry, and they're coming forward. This army is fleeing. They have the machine guns to try to screen them, to try to see if they can pull it out of the fire. Each one's 50. So 50, 100, 150, 200. So in their minds, it's 200, the equivalent of 200 riflemen firing at 600. And the thought was that, yes, this would prolong the battle, but that they would be essentially defeated quite quickly by this advancing force because machine guns can't move. They'd be out in the open, and machine gun, like I said before, it's crewed by 2 to 4, 6 at the most individuals. They would be shot down with rifle fire, and then again, the battle would continue along the same formula that they expected. But what they didn't take into account is that if you're scared and you're panicked and you're trying to aim at someone 1,000 yards away, 500 yards away with a rifle, and keep in mind the machine guns wouldn't just be sitting out there. They would be often kind of dug in a little ditch, or they would be behind some trees or something harder to see. It would be hard, you'd be panicked, and it'd be hard to draw that careful shot that you would need to hit one of the machine gunners. Whereas shooting a machine gun when you're scared is not particularly hard. You push the trigger, you pull the button, and you move it back and forth. And you're shooting out 500-600 rounds a minute. You don't need to be calm and collected to use it well. So you can imagine you're one of these soldiers here. You have to be calm. You have to make a careful, collected shot at somebody who's a hard target to hit, a long ways away, whereas these machine gunners are just sweeping their guns back and forth, back and forth. And these soldiers were not trained on how to deal with something like this. The answer was always stand your ground, be calm, be collected, fire carefully, advance, finding a place to hide, finding a better position, that was slowing things down. You need to keep moving forward. Well, what ended up happening was that these forces here were just mowed down in shocking numbers. And they would have to fall back. Now this turned everything on its head. This side should have been the winning side. And again, what do we have here? 4 machine guns, at most 20 men. How is it that 20 men are turning around, an entire battalion, hundreds of men? And this is what happened on the opening days of the war over and over and over again before things solidified. And what ended up happening was that this army over here was too beat up to do anything. They couldn't go forward. They couldn't chase after them. The infantry had just been shot to pieces. These machine guns are too heavy to move. And these soldiers who had pulled back, they weren't going to go anywhere. They just pulled outside of the range of the machine guns. So you have two forces separated with each other and not really sure what to do. Now, you might be wondering, then how did anybody ever win a battle? Well, a lot of that had to do with, in the early days of the war, when Germany was advancing into Belgium and into France, was part of it could be chalked up to training. A big part of it was the French were taught to be aggressive, and they did this every time and got pushed back. So they suffered a lot of casualties. The Germans' artillery was a little bit, they had more of it. Well, more artillery was better suited for what they needed. But a big difference was that in the French and British armies, these machine gun crews, the person who got assigned to the machine gun crew was often the worst guys in the group. Partly because what I said before, they figured that, the epitome of the soldier was to stand fast in the line and to be a great shot. And if Jacques or Tommy was a terrible shot, well, then we'll just put him in charge of the machine gun, because anybody can hit something with a machine gun. The Germans had a different outlook. They viewed the machine gun as a more pivotal and useful weapon, not just a defensive weapon. So they often put their very best soldiers on the machine guns. So occasionally, even though if the situation was reversed, if it was the French on the losing side, you imagine you don't have your best men manning these machine guns, and even though they might be in a position that they could defeat the oncoming force, if people panic and get up and run, then they can't. But the Germans have the advantage that this often held on counterattacks, because these were sometimes often their best soldiers. So that's the problem. That's what we're coming into. Now let's take a look at how things developed over time. As I said, that stalemate ensued, and both sides began to construct the infamous trenches. Now, a trench system in the First World War would have looked something like this. Now, it looks like a little sawtooth pattern, and the reason for that is that trenches weren't dug in a straight line. It was for two main reasons. The first one being that if a shell landed and shot shrapnel in every direction, it couldn't go very far. It would be compartmentalized. Also, if someone got into the trench, an enemy came into the trench, you couldn't just move up the line. You had to essentially fight a bunch of mini trenches the whole way up. But this is typically how they were constructed. There would be a front line. There would be a secondary line. And there would usually be a reserve line. And the distances between these really varied. It could be anywhere from a couple hundred yards to a few miles. And then they often had little support trenches going back and forth. So you could move troops back and forth, and it turned each one of these little things into a little grid. Now, here's the problem that you have, is that you have this stalemate, and the attacker is always going to have an advantage in the sense that he is choosing where the attack is going to take place, so he can concentrate his forces. So let's say we have a defending situation, and this would be pretty typical. This is early in the war, so think like 1915. And think of these as companies, which at this point would have been smaller in number. They started making them smaller, so maybe about 150 men, 200 men maybe. And they would always make the front line the strongest line. And then behind it, you had your support line, and it was a little weaker. Things were spread out more. And then the back was the weakest line of all, the reserve line. But to really pivot things out, you would have maybe up front, you would have a machine gun. maybe more, maybe you'd have two in a certain sector. I mean, just depending on where they were in. And these trenches, you can imagine, I mean, they were often deep, much taller than a person. They would have little fortified areas, places people could hide, and dugouts when shells started. They were a complicated, almost like an anthill. They would have little tunnels that would go off into the sides where people could hide, keep supplies. And so now imagine that you want to try to push through. The idea always was that you had, and imagine too that this is a continuous line from the English Channel all the way down to the Swiss Alps. Hundreds of miles of this interwoven into various terrains. There was no way to get around it. So the idea would be that one side would punch through the other. They could surround all of the people stuck in these trenches and force them all to be captured and end the war. That was the big dream. So now imagine that you're attacking this force. So you have your oncoming infantry. And it would be much more than this. Usually when they tried to prepare an attack, the idea was you wanted to have an advantage 2-to-1, 3-to-1, maybe even more. So let's see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 companies. So over here, we'd imagine there would be 12 or 20. But this wasn't all they had. They would have barbed wire strewn all along the front line here. And oftentimes what they would do is they would make it thicker, and it would come out a ways in places. So what it would do is by default it would funnel incoming troops right in front of the machine guns. Now as I'm going through this, a lot of this is not going to sound pleasant, and it's not. And that's, I think, something important to remember. I think that World War I does a wonderful job of stripping away any sense of glory or mystique about what war is. I think it's a very useful war to study in that sense, because it just gives you a sense of just the awfulness. And with that disclaimer, we'll proceed. So the initial thought was the way to get through was to overwhelm the enemy with both numbers of people and with firepower. So the artillery, which would be far off, cavalry was next to useless in this kind of situation, would be firing at a distance, and the idea was that they would be slamming and slamming and slamming this front area, and the men inside would run into the various dugouts to stay away from the incoming fire. And then as they would do that, as they were getting hit, these troops would move forward. And they would also try to focus on the barbed wire, trying to use the shells of the cannons to just blast it to pieces to make holes in it. But that didn't usually work very well, and individual soldiers had to go up with wire cutters and try to cut paths through this. And we're not talking about, a cow pen. We're talking about coils and coils going on, dozens, even hundreds of yards of just fence structure after fence structure after fence structure. It's not just one line of barbed wire. And the idea that would happen is that as the infantry approached, the artillery would start to move back. They would call it a creeping barrage. That it would move this way to always be in front of the advancing infantry, so to offer them some protection from counterattacks. And the problem is, like I said, there is no radios. This had to be done visually. Well, it was mostly done with timers. So the idea being that the attack is launched at 9 o'clock, and from 9 o'clock to 9:05, this area is going to get hit, and then it's going to move 100 yards forward every 30 seconds. And sometimes it moved too slow, and the infantry were stuck behind their own wall of artillery fire. Other times it moved way too fast. Other times it accidentally swung back on their own troops. They didn't have radios. You can imagine if you were part of one of these companies, the only way to tell them and the artillery fire was off was to send somebody back. And let's assume that they made it back. That's, a couple of minutes, 15, 20 minutes of running to get to the right person. And then at that point, they have no idea what's going on. How do you adapt? So again, communications was a big part of why this was a problem. The other issue is at the time, the smallest unit that had any autonomy was a company, about 200 men. So the only person who could make a decision of where we go or what we're going to really do would be the company commander. So you had one man, with subordinates making decisions for these 200 men, but they had to act as a unit. They were essentially were stuck as a single moving entity. And what would end up happening is, let's say things went well. The first or second companies might have been shot down as they tried to cross, but eventually these units would get through, and there they are into the first line of trenches. Now let's say they were really lucky and they succeeded. They knocked out these machine guns. They would have to dive into the trench and fight hand to hand with this, is using rifles like clubs, knives, fighting grenades, hand to, very gruesome combat. And again, let's say they won and they took out this company here. They got through. Well, then where do you go from there? Usually if somebody punched a hole, it's because they were fortunate, but it doesn't mean that the unit up here did it or the unit down here did it. So all of a sudden, here you are on the trench line, and this unit sends some of its troops up here. This unit sends some of its troops here. Even if you were lucky and they were occupied and they couldn't, that's what the reserve units were for. They would move up to here, leave here, come forward, and all of a sudden, the incoming infantry are being fired on from 3 directions. And they have no way of relaying messages back as to where they need their artillery. And this was the deadlock. This is what they couldn't figure out an answer to. And the problem was, even if they got through this line, they'd get to this line. And even if they got through this line, even if they broke through the trench line, which occasionally they did, there was usually another set of trenches a mile or 2 back, or at very least cavalry units that could ride up and sort of plug the gap. And even if they couldn't plug the gap, they could slow them down enough, because this area called no man's land, the area that wasn't owned by either side, was tore up by shells and barbed wire. By the time they could bring enough troops in, they had already set up a second set of trenches way back, further back. So this was the deadlock. This was, how do we get around this? And both sides, both the Germans and the British, by the time 1918 rolled around, actually did find a way to deal with this. So let's take a look at those real quickly. So we'll start with the British, the Allies, the British and French system. So again, we have the layers of trench line. Let's do this real quick. And again, you have the barbed wire fronts. Now, what they did to get through this is they essentially used tactical changes along with technological changes to give them the upper hand. So, sorry, machine gun. So now we have that same company I told you, that building block. Now they started to realize that, and you have to understand that prior to the war, being an officer was almost a social thing as much as a military rank. It wouldn't do to have a bunch of low-ranking people, social-ranking people calling themselves officers. So that was a tricky thing, but they realized they needed more. That this commanding these big, bulky units just didn't have the flexibility they needed. So they started having them use, even though platoons had been around, they were more of an organizational thing. Now platoons, so imagine this unit broken into 3 platoons. We're starting to operate independently. So even though the whole unit was a company, once battle started, it would be the platoons that would really do the heavy lifting. And instead of being 150 men here, you have 50 men in each platoon. Now they would also be paired with tanks. And I don't know exactly what the symbol, I guess, it's supposed to be a propeller. Looks more like a peace sign, but you'd have airplanes as well playing a part in the battle. I'll use that instead. So you had, and this is what was known as combined arms. It's a modern term, but that's what the idea is. You have, instead of having the war being on the back of the infantryman with his rifle, you have lots of things. You have artillery working with tanks, working with infantry, working with planes. So what would end up happening in this case, we have the same formula. Oftentimes the same numbers of troops would be involved. It's not like they just came up with more people. But what you would have is that you would have the tanks go forward, which were more or less bulletproof, and they could crush through this barbed wire. And they could make a path that the infantry could follow. Now, instead of this one big hulking mass trying to come through, you had these separate units. So you would have 2 units coming up behind the tanks, and then they would stop and they would provide cover fire into the trenches. So, symbols of cover fire coming into the trenches. And the reason you couldn't do this before the war was because now these units start to have assault rifles, or not assault rifles, but automatic weapons, portable automatic weapons. Before, if you split up a unit like this into 3 groups and you just had rifles, well then these 2 men hanging back, or these 2 units shooting, wouldn't have the firepower they would need to keep this group, or keep these soldiers ducking down in the trenches. And when this group approached the trench and got in there, there wouldn't be enough of them to overwhelm the people guarding the trench. But now, with automatic weapons, one of these small groups could put out a lot of firepower. And they could keep these heads down. And as the tank would come in, then one at a time, you'd have 1, 2, 3. These platoons would get themselves into the trench system. And again, they were able to operate independently. Instead of thinking, well, do we go north? Do we go south? What do we do? You could have one group go down here and secure this trench point. You could have another go here. You could have this group providing fire across as it came over. It gave a lot of tactical flexibility. In the meantime, you still did have that system of the artillery coming in and doing the creeping barrages, but they also started to introduce what they called box barrages. And essentially, it was kind of what it sounds like, that there would be pre-plotted, so this is no longer, an artilleryman looking down the barrel of a gun and aiming, but planning things based on mathematics and based on pre-plotted maps, that they could say, okay, well, once this attack goes in, it would be called a beaten zone, the idea of where the shells are landing. You'd say, well, this area here is going to be boxed in. In fact, that's where we get the word from barrage. It's actually from French, and we think of barrage as like throwing a lot of things, but barrage actually means fence. And that's what it was referring to, that we have this fence that gets set up around the incoming troops. So when these troops would try to surround or try to come in and pen in these soldiers, they couldn't do it. They would hit these barrage points where you can imagine the shells just raining down. It blocked them from getting through. And then later in the war, this would often be paired with chemical weapons. So even if you were willing to brave through it, you'd have to have a gas mask on to get through. It would limit your vision. It would make it harder to see the enemy troop. It would be panicking. So And then what could happen is that this barrage at a set time could start to expand out. It could move this way, and the box would open itself up, allowing for more and more reinforcements to come in. The whole time, you have aircraft helping to guide and relay these messages. They could relay back instantly, this part of the barrage is creeping forward too far. They need to pull it back. Or, the troops are moving forward. We need to start moving the barrage forward, even though no message had gotten back because the pilot could see. Finally, the planes could come back and just simply drop bombs and shoot machine guns at troops in the rear, pulling them in. And with this combined system, the Allied troops were able to crack through this trench system and advance through. Now, the Germans also developed a system. And I'll show that real quickly. But how the Germans did it was quite different. The Germans didn't have the manufacturing ability to make these new planes and new artillery, and they had new planes and artillery. They couldn't produce them at the same rates to make these types of tactics possible. Even though I think you could maybe argue they were better, but what the Germans did have were soldiers, and experienced soldiers. They had been fighting in this war for a long time, and they adapted new techniques. So let's flip it around. So now we'll say that our Germans are our blue side here. So they would have artillery, and they didn't really have tanks, but they would have planes, and they would do many of these same things. But instead of using tanks and complex artillery bombardments to break through, they used what they called stormtrooper tactics, or probably more accurately what we would call today infiltration tactics. So remember before where I talked about the unit breaking down into its separate platoons. The Germans took it a step further. They broke down each platoon into groups or squads. So now you have a company of 150 men. That's pared down to a platoon of 50, and that's pared down even further to groups of 15 or so. And what they would do is that whereas the Allies would do these massive artillery bombardments that would just smash the front line, to use a modern term, the shock and awe effect. The Germans towards the end of the war didn't have artillery in the numbers or the amount of ammunition to copy this. So what they would do quick barrages. It would be very intense but short. And the advantage of that would be, you would think that a longer barrage would be better, but it didn't allow troops off the map at a distance to, okay, they're slamming this place. This is where the point of attack is going to be. We need to start bringing in reinforcements. It would be short, maybe 10 minutes, just enough to get the troops to hunker down in their dugouts. And now these small units would start to come in. And this relied on, whereas the Allies were relying on technology, this was relying on training and motivation. These units were hand-picked, very athletic men, very motivated men, very aggressive men. And what they would do is when they came up to the front lines, I'll put in the barbed wire too, because that was always an important aspect. When they came to the front lines, instead of just charging forward, they would move and weave around, and they would find gaps in the line. There might be, the barbed wire is a little thinner right here. The soldiers here, there aren't as many defenders here as maybe down here, and they would find ways into the trench line. And then instead of stopping to engage the troops, so maybe this unit would be fighting, but then this one was coming up with it, instead of helping to support them, instead of destroying this unit moving on, these ones just kept moving. And they would get into the rear, they would come back, and eventually what you would have is you'd have a battlefield with these tiny stormtrooper units here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and they were paired with the same type of automatic weapons that I talked about before, light automatic weapons that the Allies had, that this just became chaos. These defending troops, where are we being attacked from? Are they behind us? Do we need to pull back? They didn't see anything. There would have been a large force of men. And what this caused was these groups to essentially become overwhelmed and disorganized. And then the larger, less well-trained units, just your typical German companies, would then come into this chaos and could just push right through. And again, this also allowed them to break the trench system. So this was how the Germans were able to also break through the deadlock. At the end of the last year of the war, 1918, as I said, the year that these tactics would be much more familiar to a modern military individual than the 1914 tactics. The 1918, the staticness didn't really exist as much. There were battles in 1916 where hundreds of thousands of people were killed and wounded for moving the front line 100 yards, 200 yards. In 1918, things were moving in miles, and the war was returned to a war of movement. Now, the downside, what made this system the German system essentially weaker, was that this system worked, but it caused high casualties amongst these small units. And whereas with the Allies, you can always build more tanks, more planes, more artillery pieces. You can't make new, experienced, motivated troops. So by the time in the later war, much of these units, these stormtrooper units, were gone. They had been casualties. They evaporated in the last months of the war. And what was left was these less experienced, less motivated, less well-trained German units. Now, to be sure, they were dangerous, and they weren't lacking in training compared to the Americans. The Americans were much worse. But by the time the Americans got into the thick of the war, it was after the spring offensives where these types of tactics were used, and these troops were essentially no longer inactive units. Now, with that said, we'll wrap things up. This kind of explains some basic concepts of World War I tactics, and I hope this kind of helps you understand both why it was so difficult for the armies to move, and then later how they were able to change that, how the deadly puzzle was unlocked. But there's one more aspect here, which this video is getting long, so I won't put into it, is that by the end of the war, this static trench system of strong front line, weaker support line, weakest reserve line, ended up getting scrapped because both sides had found a way to get past it. So, it's like this constant game of evolution, and a new system called the defense in depth was developed. And my next video will cover that, because it'll lead to, that was the forces that the Americans were fighting against when they attacked the Germans. This was not at all what that attack looked like. The defensive structure that the Germans were using at that time had evolved to something very different, but I wanted to give this as an example so you understood what it evolved from, and to also get a sense of how much things had changed during the war. So I hope this was informative for you, and hope to see you in the next video. Thanks.